G'day team, Matt Crummins here, and thanks again for joining me in the Learning Gallery, where we're here to dissect some of my favourite images. We're going to talk about how I went about constructing the composition, the logic behind the settings that I chose, and of course, a bare all walkthrough of the edit, from raw file to polished product. Now, let's jump right in as we head to Whyalla in South Australia and take a peek at how I captured this image of an Australian classic. All right, let's get straight into the composition part of this shot. So there's a couple of things I think you can take away from what I've done here. And I'll say the first thing actually comes down to the weather condition and the timing. And that does play a big role in how we compose an image. So this had been a really rainy day. It was absolutely bloody miserable. It had been belting down with rain, followed by glimpses of sunshine, rainbows, and then rain, rainbows, sunshine, rain. It just kept going around in circles. But it did give us a really, really moody backdrop. And I think that that was an important element that I wanted to keep in the shot. So that plays into the idea of going into that wider shot with multiple kangaroos in it, rather than honing in on a single roo. Because the moment you hone in on that single roo, especially on a long telephoto lens, it's going to crop that background right in, and we're going to lose that atmospheric kind of moody sky that we've got going on there. The other thing that plays into this as well is the light. So when you look at this particular shot, I'll pop it up full screen here, you can see that there's actually a lot of our foreground, and in fact our roos are broken up with the light playing with the rain. So you can see in the foreground here, we've got these beautiful raindrops, and because it's backlit, those raindrops are catching the light and creating that kind of sparkly, sort of almost like diamond encrusted foreground. And even on our roos, if we crop right in on them, you can see that those little water droplets across their back, as well as the back rim lighting. So the rim lighting is this kind of light that sort of surrounds the outline of the animal. That's giving us that sense of depth, as well as some really kind of small little sparkle highlights in that shot to really, I guess, accentuate the shapes and kind of the silhouettes. Having them silhouetted also creates a little bit of mood in the photo here as well, because obviously it's a bit of a darker, gloomier shot with all those kind of rainy skies. In terms of the general composition, I do like to think about my wildlife in two ways. And there's one or three ways, and one that I like to most of the time try and avoid. I like to think about wildlife shots as animals in escape. So in this particular case, you've got the roos and you've got the whole landscape behind them. And to me, this actually makes a really, really nice kind of wall print style photo where it's not just of an animal, it's actually an atmosphere, it's a scene, it's something that you might take you back to a certain place. Alternatively, I do like wildlife shots as well, where you actually crop in on a section of the animal. So maybe it's just a face or just, a feature of that animal. What I don't tend to love too much, and I'll show you an example of this here. I don't tend to love photos where it's just a single animal on their own, because this very much becomes a photograph of a kangaroo, as opposed to the photograph here, which is of the roos in that environment. So composition-wise here, it was a pretty easy choice. I mean, obviously I've taken the other photo as well, but in terms of what I really love and want to publish, this picture is going to be the winner because it's got that whole atmosphere around it. Now, the other thing you could think about from a composition perspective, if I go into the develop module, is that it very much does obey the rule of thirds. We've got a third down the bottom, which is our foreground. We've got that middle third, which is our roos, and the top third, which is our kind of sky and breathing space. Lucky last, from a composition perspective, I've also gotten myself down really low to the ground here and shot across those bushes. And that's going to play into the settings part that we'll talk about next. But getting down low means we've introduced some foreground that's really close to the camera. And you can see that drop off of the foreground. So it blurs in the very, very start of the shot and it starts to get sharper and sharper, which is our depth of field. But if we didn't get down low to the ground in the first place and introduce that foliage in the foreground, we wouldn't be able to get that kind of drop off effect. So getting down low has kind of achieved two things for us. It's given us that natural foreground with the blur off. And the other thing it's done is raise the kangaroos off the horizon line, which means that their silhouettes are actually against the bright sky. Whereas if we were up a little bit higher, their silhouettes would be against the quite complicated foliage and bushy areas in the scene. And that's going to make the photo a lot messier and a lot more cluttered. So composition-wise, it's a relatively straightforward and simple composition, but there's quite a lot of thought process behind it. And of course, the last part of the composition here is really the timing, about trying to make sure at least one of these roos, our key roo here, is looking straight towards the camera to really engage the audience there as well. If the roos were all just grazing on the ground and kind of had their heads down, this photo really wouldn't have the same impact that I think it does in this particular form. So in terms of settings, this is actually really straightforward. Whilst it was a dark and gloomy day, it was quite glary. So all of that sun that's coming through lit the clouds up and actually gave us quite a lot of light around the scene. So whenever I'm shooting wildlife photography, almost, 50% of the time, I'm actually going to be shooting in aperture priority mode rather than shutter priority mode. The reason being that most of the time I'm worried about the depth of field, and the vast majority of animals that I'm photographing aren't moving all that fast. So I don't actually need to lock in a shutter speed that's remarkably fast. All I need is something that's fast enough to freeze whatever action might happen. Now, it happens to be that roos, when they're grazing like this, really don't move very fast at all, and I certainly wasn't expecting to get a photo of it starting to bounce off if they all moved. If they did move, they're likely going to jump in the other direction to me, not towards me or straight ahead, and so it wasn't going to be a very compelling shot even if they did move in any dramatic way. Now, here's the cool thing about this. I also use automatic ISO when I shoot in aperture priority mode because it just helps to compensate when, we have a slightly lower light situation. It allows the camera to shoot a bit faster. Now, a part of this is to also introduce a third kind of subsetting in our settings, right? So I'm in aperture priority mode, and that means the camera's choosing the shutter speed as well as the ISO. But there's also this really cool feature in a lot of cameras called a minimum shutter speed. And we go into this quite a lot of detail in my wildlife workshop out at Healesville Sanctuary. But this minimum shutter speed basically allows you to tell the camera, you can choose the shutter speed, but you can't go slower than this particular value. Or you can just influence it and say, look, I'm not going to tell you exactly what value is going to be the limit, but just make sure that when you're prioritizing where you get your light from, the shutter or the ISO, prioritize keeping the shutter a little bit faster than usual or remarkably faster than usual. Different cameras have different options, but it is a very clever way to be able to ensure you get a reasonably fast shutter speed without needing to micromanage your settings. So aperture priority, automatic ISO, and as you can see, I've probably had my shutter speed set to a faster minimum shutter speed, which is kind of in that ISO settings. That sounds really confusing, but we do go into it a lot of detail in that on my workshops. So you can see here, because it was quite bright and glary, the camera's actually chosen 100 ISO, which is fantastic. It gives us a remarkably good image quality. That's nice low ISO, so there's very little grain. It also gives us a lot of dynamic range. Now, dynamic range is the difference between the darkest and the brightest point in our shot. And naturally, because there's a lot of light around, the camera's also, just by chance, chosen 1/1600th of a second, which is actually probably fast enough to freeze the action of these roos, even if they did jump off. So I don't actually have to choose the shutter speed in an environment like this. The camera is doing all the work for me, and all I need to do is to manage the exposure by exposing up brighter or up a little bit or down a bit darker using my exposure compensation. So to give you an idea what that actually looks like, this is the original image. Now, you might think to yourself, whoa, that's really contrasty and what the hell, Matt, you can hardly see the roos and the sky looks kind of blown out. But here's the thing, whenever you're photographing any kind of wildlife or landscapes, this is kind of a blend of both, you're not really looking at how the photo looks on the screen. What you're really wanting to focus your attention on is the histogram here. So if you look at the histogram in the top right on this screen, you can actually see, I'm not going to go into the full details of histograms. If you want to have a look at histograms, I do have an online course for them. But you can see here that the black areas, so whilst these roos look pretty much black, they're nowhere near black at all. They're actually quite far up. So these roos are going to be somewhere in that sort of 5% bright range. And in fact, this sky, as much as it looks like it's blown out to white in that top right-hand area, it's actually not at all. You can see that the highlights in here are not blown out at all. Now, if you want to see a more graphical representation of this in Lightroom, you can hit the J key, or you can choose these little tiny kind of nodule triangle-y looking things. And what they're going to do is give you warnings when something's crushed to black or blown out to white. So an example here, if I did blow the whites out, you would start to see with that warning on this kind of red highlight. It's the same as the blinky you see on your camera screen when you're in playback. And then you've also got, if I crush blacks, you would see they would go to that blue. Now, if I just reset those sliders for a second, you'll notice that I actually haven't blown out the highlights and I haven't crushed the blacks, which means that all my information is still there. Regardless of how this looks on the back of my camera screen, I know this photo is going to be primed for editing as long as it's nice and sharp. So I would have zoomed in on this shot, checked it, gone, whoa, yep, you can see all the little water droplets on their faces. That to me is nice and sharp, happy with that. Then it's time to take it over to the edit. Alrighty, from an editing perspective, this is actually pretty straightforward, but I think it's important before we get started in an edit that we understand what we're trying to achieve in the first place. Now, I'm not going to completely and perfectly replicate the edit that we've got going here because I'm doing this on the fly. This is not rehearsed. I don't look back at the settings and go, I moved the slider to here. I'm going to show you how I would do this in real time. So it might not be perfectly the same, but we're going to get it pretty close. Now, what do I want to achieve in this edit? It's a dark, moody, gloomy day. So therefore, I want to reflect dark, moody, and gloomy in my shot. So let's think about what that means for us. It means that we want to have some drama in the clouds. We definitely want to bring up the brightness of the kangaroos so we can actually see the fur and some of the water droplets. I'd love to accentuate some of the water droplets in the foliage because it really shows off the rainy aspect of this. And I want to probably make sure that I don't oversaturate it. If anything, I'm probably going to desaturate this image a little bit because less color gives it more of that gloomy kind of moody look. So we're going to have a look at the saturation and vibrancy sliders on that one. Now, I will say this is not a particularly complicated edit. This is something that most people who are even a beginner in Lightroom could probably achieve. We're not going to do huge amounts of localized editing. So in our develop module here to start with, I would always change my profile to something that was more appropriate. Now you could choose Adobe Landscape for a shot like this because whilst it is wildlife, it's also kind of animals. Whilst it's wildlife, it's also kind of landscapey. So you could change it to Adobe Landscape. However, I find a lot of the time, if you hit this little kind of like little grid here, it'll give you the camera matching ones. And I find that sometimes the camera matching profiles can actually be a little bit more compelling. Now, if you hover over them, you'll see those start points. Yeah, that's not looking too bad. You know what? I think for today, we're just going to go with the Adobe Landscape there. We can fix up some of the contrast issues in a second, but I would suggest try your own camera settings or the camera matching settings in here before just jumping straight to the Adobe ones. Sometimes I think, especially on Canons and Nikons, where they've got really good color profiling, I think that can work better. Even on the Fujis, I think you can do it in here. I'm not sure entirely, but I'm pretty sure you can match them in here. Okay, so next thing we want to do is to try and balance out the exposure of this scene before we get too complicated with thinking about all the details. And this is really straightforward. We've got bright skies, highlight, dark roos, shadows. So all I would do here is I'm going to pull my highlights down, and you can see it brings back a little bit of that sky. And then I'm going to bring my shadows up, which is my roos. Now, as we do this, you can see the shot starts to balance out, but I think on the whole, it might actually be looking a little bit too bright. So rather than trying to pull my highlights down further because they're already at -100, I can actually get this balanced, and then I could use the exposure slider to actually pull the overall brightness down. And that's going to really, really kind of help to, I guess, pull the highlights down further without needing to get all sort of into masking and stuff like that. It's kind of an extension, I guess. You pull the highlights down to -100. If they're still not far enough, then you pull the overall exposure down, and then you might need to do more serious recovery on the shadows. That's essentially kind of how it works. From here, I would be thinking a little bit about the color, because the color is the next main problem for me. There's a lot of very, very vibrant greens in here, and I really don't want vibrancy in this shot. Now, just to sort of define the difference, saturation and vibrancy are both to do with color, but vibrancy is to do with, or it's only going to affect colors that are of a certain vibrancy or brightness to start with. So think about it as like, a landscape scene as an example. If you have a bright blue sky, bright green foliage, but then some earthy toned rocks, well, likely if you move the vibrancy slider, it would change the saturation of the sky and the bright greens, but it would leave the earthy tones alone because earthy tones aren't don't tend to be described as vibrant kind of tones. So in this particular shot, if we pull down the overall saturation, that is going to work. However, if we pull down the vibrancy, it'll actually only affect those greens in the foreground there, which are quite bright. From here, team, I'm going to suggest that we might want to go and just retinker with that exposure a tiny touch. Now, if you wanted to, you could also have a look at the white balance here. Now, depending on how you shot it in the first place, you could actually try and accentuate the cool tones or that sort of miserable gray feel by moving your white balance around. So moving your color temperature ever so slightly from this kind of warm tones, which are the yellows there, across to the blue tones. So you can see shifting that white balance here is going to warm that image up. We don't want to warm it up too much, even if there is a bit of sunshine poking through, because it is going to kind of create a bit more of a yellow tobacco-y shot or tobacco-y kind of stain across the photo. And if you were to print this, I think you're going to find that the more neutral gray is going to work a little bit better here. So there we go. Now, I don't think you need to do much more to this image if I'm to be perfectly honest. However, if you wanted to get a little bit crazy with it, there are a couple of things we could try and do. Firstly, we could try and accentuate the water droplets in the foliage. And the second thing we could try and do is get a little bit more texture out of those kangaroos. Now, I don't want to use the texture slider as an overall edit in this particular shot, because what it's going to try and do is also add texture to the areas in my photo that are meant to be blurry. And that's going to kind of take out the smoothness of that blur. So instead, what I'm going to do as a really simple fix, I'm not going to go and mask out objects and all that sort of junk, because let's face it, if you've got really detailed edits, that's really important. But for this, we've kind of got this big slab in the middle that's in focus. And so here we go, we're going to get a radial gradient. I'm going to stick it through the center like that, just covering those roos as well as that area where we have the shot in focus. There we go. So a nice kind of big radial gradient. And now we're going to go and add that texture or clarity into it. Now I'm going to suggest that texture is probably the correct one to use. We'll just zoom in here. There we go. As we add the texture in, notice it just brings out those water droplets and the fur kind of clumped together a bit. If we were to use the clarity, that does work as well, but you can see it's kind of ruining the background a tiny touch there, and it's a little bit too harsh. So what I'm going to suggest is pop that clarity up a little bit. Sorry, pop the texture up a little bit, not the clarity. And I reckon that even if we bump the clarity by like +5 or something, so a really relatively low number, that is going to assist with bringing out the details there. And it's starting to look a little bit crunchy, so I'll pull it back a bit. There we go. Maybe we go +10 on the texture and +5 on the clarity. And so as a finished product team, what we've managed to do is to maintain that nice dark gloomy kind of look, although we have brought out the texture in the roos and in those water droplets through a really basic edit. Now, I know it's always tempting to go for the more complex tool, things like object masking and whatnot, but this is a great example of where I wouldn't go into more detail with those masking tools unless it was going to produce a remarkably different result. Keep it simple and things tend to look better. You don't miss little spots when you're masking. A nice big radial filter, it's always going to be a pleasing kind of shape. The drop off there is nice and soft, or that feathering, and so we end up with what hopefully is a really, really beautiful shot of an Australian icon. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this. Hope you got something out of it. If you did, always please like, subscribe, you know the drill. Check out my website. I run workshops, I've got online courses and all sorts. Would love to see you there, and hopefully we'll get one of these videos out to you shortly so you can continue to learn through the Matt Crummins Photography Learning Gallery. Thanks for joining me, team.